That's what we're talking about. Get in the weeds, download these things, have a look at what people are doing, educate yourself as much as you possibly can. The next session is an important one for us. Senator Bragg, who will speak next, is a supporter of this industry. I have to say there have been very few politicians who've been willing to talk about this. It's a credit to him that he's been brave enough to do it. And I think the reality here is that conversation should be supported. He's also, I think, the only politician I know in Australia who has a TikTok. And he was tweeting, he was sending out TikToks about this event as well. It's easy for people to sit in rooms and complain about what others are doing. Very hard for people to stand up when they're outliers in these conversations and say, let's give these things some consideration. Senator Bragg, Senator for New South Wales, also the chair of a committee that's looking at probably the most important conversation for us as an ecosystem in Australia, which is the regulation and a regulatory framework that gives innovative businesses, people who are looking to build things, some certainty that Australia is a great place to start a business, to run a business and to export from. I appreciate the fact that he's made the time available this morning. The Senator will speak for a few minutes and then we'll jump onto a panel. But Senator Bragg, welcome and thank you for your time.
Well, Steve, good morning to you and good morning to everyone at the NFT Fest. It's great to be with you, and I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners. Can I just start by also saying that I know that people think that there's some sort of Canberra bubble. Now, that is absolutely true, regrettably, and one of the consequences of that is that we are a long way away from the market. Now, that is a general problem for government. But in the space that you're in the blockchain space, we are a really long way away from the market. And so for us to get as close to the market as we need to be, given how important these issues are now to our democracy and our society and our economy, we have to do a lot of listening. And what I've tried to do over the past 6 months is been to use my ears and my mouth proportionately. Of course, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for those that are wondering about that. And so there's been an enormous amount of effort that's come from the blockchain space. And I really wanted to thank you, Steve Vallas, for your leadership and all the work that you do at blockchain. So, look, I think it was only about 6 weeks ago that Ted Cruz in the US Senate said that there was literally only a handful of US politicians who knew anything about cryptocurrency and digital assets. And I'd say the same is true in Australia. There may be actually fewer. And so what we've tried to do over the course of this inquiry has been to educate ourselves. And so when I last spoke to Blockchain Australia, that was back in April, I promised that I would come back to you by the end of the process with a plan. Now, we've conducted 3 public hearings. We've had more than 100 submissions, some of which have been very entertaining, and I've very much enjoyed getting away from some of the boring rubbish we have to deal with in Canberra. And I've been very excited by the content. So really, there's 4 things that we'll be doing with this final part of the review. So the review is due to conclude in about 3 weeks from now. And the promise that I made you, I will keep. We will give you a plan. And that plan will be designed to put Australia at the front end of the digital asset society in the world. It will be governed by 2 competing principles, perhaps. One principle being that we want to ensure that Australians are protected. And secondly, that we want to drive more investment into Australia. Now, those 2 could be competitive or they could be complementary. We want to try and make them as complementary as possible. Now, for those of you that say we don't want to have regulation, I will remind you that your industry reps and the vast bulk of the industry is asking for some regulation. So there will be some regulation. But I'm very conscious of this point that you're making to me, that we don't want to destroy the innovation with regulation, because, of course, that would suit the incumbent vested interests, which want to see your sector destroyed by regulation that was designed for a whole different purpose. So this is a very important point I'm trying to make to you, hopefully articulately, that there will be some regulation, but I'm very conscious that we don't want to ruin innovation as part of that new process. I also wanted to reinforce a point I've made in the past, that we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. I mean, a lot of these issues can be resolved through licensing and regulation through the Treasury portfolio without using the existing licenses which exist today. So, for example, we could have some more provisions in place for digital currency exchanges. We could have some rules in place for custody, but we don't need to use the licenses which exist for the ASX. And we don't need to use the exact rules which apply to custody services in the non-digital world. Finally, I want to reinforce another important point for those of you that have the displeasure of knowing me, is that I don't like to squib it. I like to land judgments. I like to take risks. And I think that you deserve more than just a series of recommendations for new inquiries, task forces, and further reviews. So we will be making some hard recommendations. I welcome your feedback on those hard recommendations. We will want the major parties, including my party, to adopt these policies as part of their election manifestos. And so when you see the final recommendations, and I'll be looking to make fewer rather than more, because I think we want to have some really hard-hitting recommendations in a few weeks. We want your initial feedback, but we won't be recommending a dozen new inquiries and task forces. We'll be making some hard recommendations. There are some areas where, frankly, I have felt that it will be beyond the scope of the Senate to resolve all the detail. And so there will be some areas where we do need to do some more investigation, and we'll be seeking your support for that. Now, finally, before I hand over my 5-minute slot, and I'm reminded of that quote, beware the person that says they won't speak for long. I do want to, I think, refer to what is a very important topic coming up over the next month, which is Australia's commitment that we will take to the Glasgow Climate Conference. Now, I know that there are mixed views about the impact of digital assets on the environment and the amount of electricity that can be used. I just put the simple fact that we are trying to get to net zero. We want to get there as soon as we can. I personally think it's highly and strongly in our economic interests to transition to a net zero economy. And in the area of digital assets using a lot of electricity, we want that to happen on a renewable basis, because we are a renewable energy superpower, and we also want to be strong on digital assets. So I think it's a unique opportunity for the industry to pull those two things together and to deliver ultimately, a stronger digital asset sector, but one that is powered with renewable energy. We don't want to burn up the grid, and we don't want to burn up fossil fuels for any purpose, frankly. And so that's where Australia needs to go. So once again, thanks a lot for having me. And I'm very happy to take any questions that you would like me to address in the fullness of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And I can affirm, yes, you don't like squibbing it. That's absolutely right. And I've said to people often, standing in the middle of the road is a lovely place to be, but you don't get anywhere. So we're just happy to see movement and have a conversation. I think that is a public and fulsome one. So thanks for that time. I'm going to have you, if you still can, sit on this next panel, Senator, and offer some feedback in the next few minutes. I've sort of a varied panel of participants here. Steve Sammartino, futurist and TV presenter, always ready with an opinion about things. Susan Corbisiero, who was at Austrade, is now working as part of the Global Business and Talent Attraction Taskforce, an important piece of work in terms of encouraging talent into this country. And Natasha Blycha, Head of Digital Law for Herbert Freehills, as smart a person in the space as you will ever meet, I'd ask you all to switch your cameras on and unmute yourselves. And the aim here is just to have a frank conversation in the next few minutes about, where we sit here, because the reality of the rooms that I'm in consistently is that there are two narratives. The one that is the public one, we talk about we're ready, we're willing, we're able to go. And then there's the closed door version, which says we're not ready, we're not willing, and we don't know whether we can go. So, for us, the consistency here is having a conversation honestly about where we're sort of at. And on that basis, Samar, I know that you're never shy of an opinion. So, you've got some views on this. You're a raving capitalist, but you also have a sense that regulation has to fit right. So, what's the view, Samar? How does this work?
The regulation side is really important. I've just been watching the comments, and I'm thrilled to see that so many people are saying we need regulation because that facilitates innovation. Without going on too long, we swim in the benefits of regulation in our capitalist society. The water that we drank this morning when we made our coffee, the electricity that we didn't get electric shock on, the safety of our cars and our roads, all of those measures, occupational health and safety, all of those things facilitate commerce and capitalism as we know it. But it's easy to forget when technology arrives. And so what we need is a set of rules that everyone playing the game can abide by to give us the opportunity to innovate. And if we don't set a bunch of rules, then we don't end up with this idea of adversarial interoperability, right? And that's actually the thing that we really need. And we don't have that right now with big tech. If you look at the big technology firms out there, we don't have adversarial interoperability. We've got different plugs and different APIs and different rules, and you don't own your data and someone takes it. If we can get regulation that sets a set of boundaries that allow crazy innovation and competition inside of that, then we can have a universal marketplace, because that's what we don't have with big tech. We need something that's permissionless that goes across. And by doing that, then we have a chance to innovate and do even better than the American and the Chinese firms. And speaking of China, that's a classic example, right? What we don't want is what China are doing, which is banning Bitcoin, banning all of the innovation that can happen and having their top-down approach. But we don't want the wild, wild west either, because if we don't have regulation, what you end up with is tech feudalism, where you have a few giant companies that essentially do the bidding for everyone. And we can do better than that. And that's why I think NFTs are such an important thing, because all innovation often starts with artists. The first ever cars, they were designed by artists. The first use of electricity was electricians who were like magicians. So art comes first, but you need regulation to make it a competitive and capitalist marketplace.
Thought you might have a view, Samar. So it's a reasonable jump-off point for it. Natasha, at the other end of the spectrum here, working at a very large law firm, lots of very serious people wearing suits often, coming into the room saying, here's what we want to do. How do you guide them? I mean, the reality is it's so far from Discord channels and emerging tech and layer one and layer two. Where do you start? Do they have any sense of where we're going?
I think if you're a digital lawyer, you fit into the crazy category of lawyer who advises clients without actually knowing exactly what you're advising them. So it is a difficult area, but with all emerging tech, it's difficult. I just think that we bringing some balance to the debate is these are actually really quite tricky legal questions. And you do have regulators who are trying to work on them, but we're not dealing with a category of assets which are normal. And there are, just bringing up Senator Bragg's point about the custody, if I can make one comment about digital assets of why they're different to things we've seen before, is that a lot of times new platform owners or people who would like to have distributed autonomous organizations, they cannot actually see within their own platforms. So most of the laws that have been built to date in respect of property and ownership and control, people actually, there's somebody who I call the holding the baby problem. There's someone holding the baby. When you come to these assets, there's oftentimes nobody who has custody, nobody who can actually see what's happening inside the platform. That's actually not okay either. If that's going to be what we go forward with machines or code, looking at what's happening with regulation, then we're going to actually need to build new regulation to look after mums and dads, look after those other stakeholders in the community. So it's balancing innovation with also looking after other stakeholders in the community who need protections.
Susan, I'll draw you in, and I always like bringing you into a conversation because you are my origin story, Susan. You know, I've said this to you many, many times. I mean, for those on the call here, Susan let me participate in a trip to China about 5 years ago when she had no place doing such a thing. She said to me at the time, "Don't embarrass me," and hopefully I haven't embarrassed her. Here I am 5 years later, involved in conversations. But it's sort of really important to see the conversation was happening then, Susan. You know, whilst you're in the role with Austrade as well, and now in the role that you're in, I was sort of encouraged to see that, you know, games, you know, e-games, esports are an area that, and they're adjacent here. I mean, some of the industry there will move very quickly. Within that role, within that Austrade role and the role that you are now, it seems like you got that bit right. How is it that that segment was sort of was chosen? And, you know, from your perspective now, any observations you'd like to make about the way these sort of worlds will merge?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Steve. And I think you're giving me a bit too much credit there. As far as my role goes now, I'm in the Global Business and Talent Attraction Taskforce. And our role really is pretty simple. We were set up as a COVID response, and it's basically to make sure that Australia is future focused and forward looking, and we're attracting the best and the brightest, and also bringing in businesses that are going to help our future growth. So getting back to your observations of sort of how we've landed here, and it gets back to what the Senator was saying about making sure that we're positioning Australia right for that growth. I think there's some really exciting things that are happening in Australia now, and some initiatives that are coming through that, whilst it's not directly related to NFTs per se, but what it's going to do is basically support the innovation in that area. So I think what we've seen is a maturing of the conversation and different technologies coming together. And so what I've got a different slant than everybody else on this sort of call, in that I'm sort of the practitioner, the side of the business that's making sure that we're dealing with investors, that we're bringing the right people in, but we're also helping our industries grow. So the way I look at it now is you've got this convergence that the digital games sector has been a really exciting place for a number of years. They're always innovating. They're always ahead of consumer engagement. And what we're seeing now with NFTs coming in is basically, everything's merging. So from my perspective and my role, there's some really exciting stuff happening around digital games incentives that are going to basically fast track the development of our sector.
I'll come to those. Senator, come to you now, just between us, the 800-ish people that are on this call, and you and me right now. You're one of us, right? Let's on the assumption you go. You're the crypto senator as far as Australians are concerned now. They're coming to you now. What advice do you give them? You know, what's that tipping point moment for government? You know, what do you think as a community broadly we need to be doing much more loudly to give confidence to your colleagues who may not be, I'm going to be generous, may not be on the path that you're on? What should we be doing? You know, what matters in these conversations?
Well, it's a very good question, Steve. I mean, I think the answer is that, as you know, cryptocurrency and digital assets have a bit of a bad name in Canberra, and I'd say that's probably quite similar across the world. I mean, there's also a very heavy vested interest agenda here, where the incumbent financial institutions do their best to undermine innovation because, of course, they see innovation as a loss of business, and they act rationally. And so they have lobbying resources and more resources than you have, frankly, to undermine your agenda. So that understanding the starting point is important. The second thing I'd say is I do think that the innovation that the industry can deliver in terms of, you know, more choice, lower costs for doing things, effectively efficiency, are really important selling points for moving away from that unfortunate starting point that many politicians come to it at. So that's sort of my initial advice. I mean, looking forward, when this plan hits in 3 weeks from now, I mean, people should go and talk to their local members and senators about that. People, if there are things in that report that you like, you should make an appointment and go and talk to your local federal member. I mean, all of this stuff will be federally regulated. There's no role. Don't worry about the state members. I mean, there's nothing wrong with them, but don't worry about them. And you should make the point that this is an important part of Australia's future. You think this is important for X, Y, Z reason. That is the best thing that you can do.
I like the candor, Senator. That's the point here, and I think that's the call to action. And this is the conversation that I have with people often, where I say to them, you might be doing great work, but if you're not telling anyone about the great work you're doing, no one knows. Very few people care. What we see is what we know. So that call to action ultimately that says, let's make some noise about it. We should be doing this. This is something that the people on the call should take. And you're right. Something less than the resources we have. These are our resources. You're seeing it. 800 people on the call. They're the resources. So I'd encourage everyone to sort of speak up. Samar, is this the web we've always wanted? That's the promise of some of this technology. Where are we at with that?
Yeah, so let's start with the web that we've got. That's not the one that we were promised. I did a calculation this morning. The top 7 technology companies coming out of the US have a market capitalization of $9.9 trillion, which is 45% of the US GDP. So what we have now is a concentration beyond the Gilded Age and anything that we've seen in history. And that's because we didn't regulate it in a way that we should have, right? And you have absolute monopolists, people sending up rockets into space that used to be the domain of NASA and government. And it's not the kind of world that we want to live in. It was meant to be horizontalized and democratized. And what we have is something that is more powered and ensconced because we didn't regulate well. Web 3.0 gives us a chance. It actually gives us a chance to have something that is not as concentrated, that's bottom up and goes across. So I think that the vision and the idea that I have is the simple idea of gas and having platforms which aren't owned by anyone, that go beyond a world where anyone actually owns it. And the amount of money in crypto facilitates the networks that we all need. So the world that we want and the world that we'll get will be one, hopefully, where everyone can participate in a marketplace, and it almost becomes like a language that no one owns or controls, that we all operate within. And the only way you get that is by regulating in a way that we can have that. So this is actually the chance, and it starts with NFTs to actually give us the chance to move into a world where digital and physical interact in a way. This is not digital. There is no digital. There's only life. And everything that's physical is going to have a digital representation and vice versa. This is the start of smart contracting. We need to make sure now, while it's NFTs, that we get it right so that we can get Web 3.0, the democratized one that we're always hoped for.
Tim, a perfect segue into a conversation with Natasha. I mean, the reality of smart contracts is funny. If I go back to 2018, people said, I don't like blockchain, I don't like Bitcoin, but I'm mad for those smart contracts, right? It was a very digestible idea for people. I think NFTs, from my observation, it's similarly as well. People like that they can get the NFTs if they start with the JPEGs and then sort of build out. Tell me about that smart contract conversation. You know, there's enormous complexity here, and the complexity in many respects is legal. Where are we at? You know, that again, probably I guess what we were promised in 2018 that said smart contracts are the thing, and before you know it, everything will be working via and through smart contracts. Do you want to just give us the snapshot of where the smart contracts were meant to be in 2018 and sort of that conversation looks like for you in 2021?
I have a few different thoughts bouncing around in my head, Steve. So, I mean, the thing is with digital assets is that they increase in complexity along a continuum. So NFTs, obviously they could be a piece of digital art. Then you can move through to smart contracts. The smart contracts are the same as NFTs sometimes. So there's also a literacy problem everywhere. Going back to what was said about, we need to encourage literacy. Picking up on what Senator Bragg said, he's saying go and speak to your politicians. I would agree with that, but I would say just take it down a notch, because most of the people on this call have a level of literacy that is not understood by. So a lot of the things you're talking about, language that you use in everyday parlance, is not understood by the people that you'll go and speak to who need to understand for these changes to happen. But NFTs are often smart contracts. The Going to the end of the spectrum is smart legal contracts. That is when you actually take legally binding agreements and you put them in digitized, machine readable form. That is a form of digital assets that really can't be played with lightly. It needs to meet directors' duties, legal duties. So it has to have the identity, KYC, all those requirements. Then we move on to CDBC, central bank digital currencies, and there's a whole host of regulation that sits around that level of complexity. So lots of different requirements. Steve, when you say smart contracts, my brain doesn't know which one to talk about because there's a literacy issue. You could be talking about smart contracts, ERC20 token type smart contracts, which really just are a piece of automating code on a distributed ledger. They're kind of actually doing quite well. I mean, if you look at gaming, they're everywhere. There's trillions of dollars being moved through smart contracts. But I agree with Senator Bragg as well. We need to be very mindful about the energy consumption of the platform supporting that. And I certainly serve clients who are working on different mining operations that are trying to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases. Important. If you're talking about smart legal contracts, they're not here yet. They really need critical infrastructure to support the cybersecurity requirements around those assets. If you look in the news today, cybersecurity, we're only getting worse and worse in respect of the number of hacks that are coming. I think it's every 8 minutes we have a major cybersecurity hack. So there is an answer here for the actual plumbing support of smart legal contracts.
It's funny, back in that issue of language and literacy, Natasha, it's often the case when people come at me and they start trolling on comments, they talk about the religion that is the blockchain religion. There's no religion. No one's asking you to do this. Sit it out. Sit it out. I don't care. You know, the point here is, do you want to educate yourself? Fine. If you don't like it, no one's dragging you along, kicking and screaming. So commit the time or don't commit the time, but don't get in people's way. Is generally the sort of the position that they'll take in relation to this. Susan, here's the question for you, because here's what most people care about in life. Show me the money, Susan. Where's the money? Talk to me about tax. Tell me what's happening that gives people an incentive, because this is an ecosystem built on incentives.
Yep. Okay. So in terms of getting the setting right and positioning Australia, because I'm a mum, I've got kids that play games, I've got kids that are on the internet doing all sorts of things, and keeping up with the environment, it can be challenging at times. But what we're doing here is basically, Australians are innovators, they are creators. The point about how it all stems from creative assets. I think this is a real positive that Australia's got. So when we're talking about money and things like that, you're talking about, I suppose, what's the environment and what's going to make companies or people and industry grow here on innovation. Now, we would argue that digital games, if you actually look at the way that whole industry has worked, and it's basically developed its own industry that's bigger than movies and music. It's a $250 billion industry. But what else does it do? It actually provides the digital skills that are underpinning our digital transformation, and that is going to be used, that's being used already, for simulations, for autonomous vehicles, for advanced manufacturing, digital twins. All of that stuff came out of gaming. Okay, so why do we think this sector is important, and the innovation that it creates, it's important? It's because it's those future jobs, and it's those future jobs now. So what the Australian government has done actually, and announced in the budget, and it's effective from the 1st of July 2022, is announced a digital games tax offset, and that's directly to stimulate and create jobs in the local digital games ecosystem. Now, Australia has a great small ecosystem developing games, but we're not the scale of our counterparts. And what this tax offset does is basically encourage companies to invest in Australia, and also makes Australian companies competitive. So what we see this doing is fast tracking development, not just of digital games, but of innovation and the other technologies and the real-time 3D that comes along with it. So I find that really exciting, because it's about building the whole ecosystem and making sure that Australia is tapped in to do it, because we have the talent already. Particularly in this sector, we've had a big brain drain overseas. We want to reverse that. And we want our kids to go off and travel the world and do things overseas, but we want them to have a future here, creating and being at the forefront. And because we're smart enough and we're bright enough, and we've shown it before.
Thanks, Susan. I'm going to close out in a second. Sam, I'm going to ask you one more question, then come back to you, Senator, just to close out. Sammer, if we lean in, we scooch in here, mate. Are we kidding ourselves? Because here's the bit that always gets me. When people say Australia is punching above our weight, I want that shit to stop. I just want them to say Australia is punching. Not about, we just need to be big because we're doing big things, rather than always saying, hey, when it comes to the Sydney to Hobart yacht race, we've won time adjusted. Can we just not win, or am I kidding myself?
No, we can win, in fact. And it's interesting you say, Australia, you want us to punch. Actually, desire is the key thing. I just want to pick up on what Susan said there. Tax incentives. Guess what? That's regulation. And what does that do? That creates an incentive, because incentives shape behavior and push things forward. So I think we actually can punch, and I think we can do incredibly well. Markets are conversations. And if you converse about it in the first instance when it's growing and it's burgeoning, then you have a chance for building something. We didn't do that when it came to Web 2.0 because we had big ensconced media players. In this, we don't have it. So we actually got a chance. You look at the number of people on this call, and we've got evangelists like you. Everyone go out and read the Clue Trade Manifesto. That was written for the internet that we hoped for. And it's a book that needs revision, because markets are conversations. The more we talk, the more things happen and things get built. We can punch, baby. Bring it on. Bang.
Thanks, Sammer. Senator, I'll leave it to you to sort of close out this conversation. And again, thanks for your time here. Any final thoughts for where we're at, the Australia that we want to be?
Well, I agree with Steve. I think he's really landed some very important points today. And the reality is that big tech has way too much power over our economy and our society. And these are not Australian companies. Obviously, we're not protectionists in Australia. We welcome foreign investment, but there is a lot of power being brought to bear by these organisations, and we don't want them to run the world. So it's very important what you're doing in your industry. We will build you a plan that will, allow for those things I've talked about today. And so we very much need your support when we roll it out in the next few weeks. To make sure that you make the right noise that gets it up the ladder of importance, because there's a lot of things that people want Canberra to do. And I don't want us to be talking about this in 5 years. I want us to be able to deliver this over the next year or 18 months, which probably sounds like a long time, but in Canberra time, that's not that long. So as I say, we'll give you a good plan next month. We need your support to enact it. So I'll be in touch with you, Steve, about that. And as I say, I think, Steve, you've made some good points. We're on to those points. I'm not sure we can solve them all in this exact report, but I would say that for someone like me that's hoping to use a productive part of their life in public service, I think the battle against big tech is going to be one of the battles of the age, if not the battle of the age. And I'm up for that fight. So thanks for having me today, and really appreciate all the input that's come from your industry to the committee so far. It's really been appreciated.